We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis and Meseches Bava Kamma. This is Bava Kamma Daf 13b. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing a case where a shlomim does damage, and the question was, can we collect from the basar of that animal, of that shore, keneged the emurim, keneged the part that's supposed to go on the mizbeach? Of course, the part that goes onto the mizbeach has to go onto the mizbeach. You're not going to pay from that, but can you collect the value corresponding to what would have been collected from that, from the rest of the animal? And the Gemara says that we have the opinion of Rabbi Nosson. Rabbi Nosson says that if you have a situation where a shore and a boar together, they do damage, let's say the shore gores the animal into the pit. So the halacha according to Rabbi Nosson is, if you can't collect from the shore, you can collect from the Baal Habor, you can collect from the owner of the pit. And the Gemara here is in the middle of saying that even according to Rabbi Nosson, that's only true in that situation. But over here, when you're talking about the shlomim, aval hacha, but over here, mimotzi amar, is it possible to say, basar azik, emurin lo azik, that the meat part of the animal did the damage and the emurim did not? And Rashi explains, aval hacha mimotzi amar le al habasar nimtza hanezek yoser min ha'emurim, meaning you can't say that the damage was done more by the meat part of the animal than the emurin part of the animal. Hilkach shava chatzi ha'emurin yafsid. Therefore, the part that would have been collected from the emurim, that part he has to lose out. He can't collect from the emurim, and there's no way to really say that I should collect more from the basar because of the fact that I can't collect from the emurim. That you're not able to say in the same fashion that you are able to say that according to Rabbi Nosson when you have a combination damage from a shore and a boar. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Toda shehiziko, let's say you have a carbon toda that does damage, Gova mi besara, vieno gova mi lachma. So by carbon toda, you also bring a bread offering, and so therefore it's saying you can collect from the meat of the animal, but you're not able to collect from the bread. And the Gemara says lechem pshita. So the fact that you can't collect from the bread is so obvious. The bread didn't do any damage. And the Gemara says no, seifa itztrichle. What's needed over here is the end of this teaching of this halacha. It says nizik ochel basar umischaper mevi lechem. The nizik, he eats the meat, and the mischaper, the person who needs the kapara, he has to bring the bread. The Gemara says hanami pshita, but that's also obvious. Obviously, the nizik is going to eat the meat because he's being paid for the damage that was done to him. But the person who needs the kapara, he's of course the one that needs to bring the lechem. And the Gemara says not necessarily obvious. Mao detema, what might you have said? Kevan the lechem hechsheira dezevachu. Since the lechem, the bread, is part of the preparation of what is an acceptable carbon, so lei malei. So you should say to him, atachalt basar v'ano I see lechem. You're eating the meat and I have to bring the bread. Kamash molan, and that's what it's teaching us. The lechem chiyuva de bailam hu, that the lechem is an obligation on the bailam, on the owner of the carbon. And Rashi says lechem pshita haloazik. It's obvious the lechem is not going to pay from the lechem because it didn't do the damage. And the Gemara says nizik ochel basar. The Gemara says, well, in this case the nizik is able to eat the meat. La'achar hakravas emur, meaning after you put the emurim, the innards, on the mizbeach, so now the meat is eaten by the nizik because the nizik is owed money for the damage that was done to his property. But again, when it comes to the lechem, the baal hakarbon, the bailim still need to bring the lechem. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Nechasim shehein shel b'nei bris. And when we talk about the damages that need to be paid to somebody, it's only if the damage was done to property that's owned by a ben bris, that's owned by a Jewish person. And the Gemara says, Lemutei mai, what does that come to exclude? Ilamutei dovid kochavim, if you're saying that we're excluding the property of a non-Jew, but the Gemara says, Hakatani lo lekamon, that's already taught in the Mishnah later on. Shor shel Yisrael shenagach shor shel over kochavim pater. It says later on that if a shore of a Jew gores a shore of a non-Jew, so he's pater, he doesn't have to pay damages. That's exactly what we're saying over here by nechasim shein shel b'nei bris. And the Gemara answers, Tana v'hadim refarish. The Tana of our Mishnah is saying this halacha, but later on it's going to be clarified, it's going to be explained. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, and the Chasim HaMiyuchad, and it said in the Mishnah that it has to be property that's owned by an individual. And the Gemara says, L'mu'utei mai, what does that come to exclude? Amar Rav Yehuda says, L'mu'utei zeh omer shorcha hizik, v'zeh omer shorcha hizik. It comes to exclude a case where we're not sure exactly whose ox caused the damage. This one says it was your shore that caused the damage. The other one says, no, it wasn't my shore. It was your shore that caused the damage. And we're saying in that situation, they don't have to pay. And the Gemara says, but Hatani Lakaman, that also is taught later on. It says later on, Hayushnayim rodfin achar echad, if two are chasing after one, Zeh omer shorcha hizik v'zeh omer shorcha hizik, and this one says it's your shore that caused the damage, and the other one says it's your shore that caused the damage. Shnayim patur, and it says they're both patur. That's exactly the same as how we're interpreting the Chasim HaMiyuchadin. And the Gemara again answers, Tani v'hadim refarish. The Tana of our Mishnah teaches something, but then it clarifies, it explains it later on. And the Gemara continues, B'masnisa ton, and the Brisa was taught, what does it mean, Nechasim hamiyuchadim, prat lenichsei hefker? It means to say that let's say you have ownerless property, that's excluded from this halacha of paying damages. And the Gemara says, Hechi dami, well, what exactly is the case? What do you mean by nichsei hefker? Ilema de nagach Torah didon l'Torah de hefker. If you're saying that, let's say a situation where our ox scored an ox that belonged to hefker, meaning belonged to nobody, it was ownerless and you don't have to pay, so of course you don't have to pay, that's obvious. Man tavale, who's even claiming any money? The ox isn't owned by anyone, so who are you going to pay? So Ela de nagach Torah de hefker l'Torah didon. Rather, you'll say that what the Mishnah is talking about is, let's say an ox that's ownerless gores somebody else's ox, an individual's ox, and in that case we're saying potter. But what do you mean potter? Lezel v'leise, so he should just go and get it. It's ownerless. Let him just take the ox that gored his ox, and he'll be able to be paid back in that fashion. And the Gemara says to that, no, b'shekadam v'zocha bo'acher. The chiddush is as follows. Let's say somebody else, before this person who was damaged, had an opportunity to take possession of the ownerless ox. Somebody else went ahead and took possession of the ownerless ox, and the chiddush is that person is allowed to keep it. The person who's damaged can't say, well, I get to be the first one to be able to take it because I was damaged. He can't say that. It's a completely ownerless ox. It belongs to hefker, and therefore anyone who gets it first is able to keep it. And the Gemara continues with another interpretation of what does it mean, Nechasim hamiyuchadin. Ravina says, L'mu'utei nagach v'yachar kach hiktish. This comes to exclude, let's say a shore gores and does damage, but then the owner of that shore, he sanctifies it, he says it belongs to hektish, or nagach v'yachar kach hifkir, or let's say it gores, and then right after it gores, he makes it hefker, he makes it ownerless. So at that point in time, since at the time that it's coming to court, it's no longer owned by the individual, now it's owned by hektish, or now it's ownerless, it's owned by hefker, so in that situation, you don't have to pay. That's what it means in Nechasim hamiyuchadim. And the Gemara says, Tanya namihachi, we have a brisa that supports this as well. Yeser al kei nam Rabbi Yehuda, the brisa says that further than this, Rabbi Yehuda says, Afilu nagach v'yachar kach hiktish, even if it gores, and then afterwards the animal is made hektish. Or nagach v'yachar kach hifkir, again it gores, and then afterwards it's made ownerless. Potter in these situations as well. Potter, shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, v'huad b'va'olav v'hemis ish v'gomer, it says again that you're going to warn the owner, and it's going to kill someone. We learn from this pasuk that the time of the death and also at the time it's brought to court, it has to be the same, and therefore at that point in time when it's brought to court as well, if you made it hefker, you made it hektish, it's not going to be chayiv to pay the damages. And the Gemara says, Ugamar hadin lo bainan, but what about the Gemara din at the finishing of the court case? At that point, let's say it's made hefker. At that point, let's say it's made hektish. Is that not excluded? And the Gemara says, no. The Gemara says, hashor yisakel. The Gemara din hu dechsib. The pasuk actually goes on to say, hashor yisakel, that the axe gets stoned. That's talking about Gemara din. Sounds like even by the Gemara din, it has to belong to the person. And if it was made hektish, if it was made hefker, it will be excluded from this din of damages. And the Gemara says, you're right. Elaima achate misa v'hamada bedin u'gemar din. The time that it killed, and the time it's brought to court, and the time that the court case finishes, all of those, it has to be the same. At that point in time, it has to be owned by that owner of the ox. If he makes it hefker, if he makes it hektish at any point in time in the interim, so then he's not going to have to pay any damages. And the Gemara continues, Chutz me'reshus hamiyuchedes lamazik. The Mishnah said that if a damage takes place in an area owned by the mazik, so then the mazik doesn't have to pay. D'yamar lei, because the mazik can say to him, Torcha b'reshusi, my boy, what's your ox doing in my property? Your ox came into my property, and then my ox scored your ox. That he's not responsible to pay for. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Rishus ha-nizik v'ha-mazik, and let's say you have property that's owned by both the nizik and the mazik. And the Gemara explains, Amar Rav Chisda says, Amar Avimai, that Avimai says, Chotzer ha-shutfin, let's say you have a chotzer, it's a courtyard that belongs to partners, chayiv ba al ha-shein v'al ha-regel. You actually are chayiv when it comes to shein and regel, meaning if one of the animals of one of the owners would damage the other person's property, they would be responsible to pay, even though that property is owned by both of them. V'hachi kamar, and according to this interpretation, the Mishnah means as follows: Chutz me'reshus hamiyuchedes lamazik de potter, that with the exception of a place that is designated only for the mazik, if it's the mazik's property, then the mazik is potter. Ureshus hanizik v'hamazik kishizachav hamazik. But if it's the reshus that belongs to both the nizik and the mazik, so then the mazik does have to pay. According to Rav Chisda's interpretation, again, the mazik will have to pay in a situation of chotzer hashutfin. That's what the Mishnah means when it says ureshus hanizik v'hamazik. However, Rebbe Lozer argues, Rebbe Lozer says, Potter al hashen v'al regel. If it's a joint property, so then the mazik is actually patur from paying from shein and regel. Let's say his animal either eats the property of the other partners, or let's say steps on the property of the other partners and damages it. He will not have to pay in that case. And if you're understanding that way, this is the way you read the Mishnah. V'achi kamar, this is what it's saying. Chutz me reshus hamiyuchedes lamazik ureshus hanizik v'hamazik nami patur, with the exception of property that's owned exclusively by the mazik, but also if it's owned by both the nizik and the mazik, also that's also an exception. It's also the mazik is patur in that case. And so then what's that last line of ukashehizach chav hamazik according to this interpretation? Ukashehizach chav hamazik lasuye keren. When it says ukashehizach chav hamazik, that comes to include keren, meaning according to Shmuel, as we're about to say, keren is not listed in the Mishnah. Shor does not include keren, and therefore where is keren in the Mishnah? It comes from the phrase ukashehizach chav hamazik. And the Gemara says, Hanicha l'Shmuel. The Gemara says this works well according to Shmuel, because again, according to Shmuel, keren is not mentioned in the beginning of the Mishnah, and so therefore it's being mentioned at the end of the Mishnah when it says, Ukesh Hitzach Chav Hamazik. Ela l'Rav da'amar tana shor v'chal mili d'shor. But according to Rav, who says that at the beginning of the Mishnah, when it says shor, it includes everything that has to do with shor. It includes keren as well. So then what's this Chav Hamazik including? Chav Hamazik le'suyei mai. What's Chav Hamazik coming to include? And the Gemara says, La suyei ha d'tana rabban, and it comes to include the following Braisa. The Braisa says, Keshizach chav hamazik. What does it mean, Keshizach chav hamazik? It means, Lahavi shomer chinam v'ashoel nosei sachar v'asocher. It comes to include a shomer chinam, or a shoel, a nosei sachar, or a socher. Sheizika behema b'rishtus, and if an animal damages while it's in their rishus, let's say the person is guarding the animal, it does damage, tam mishalim chatzi nezek, umuad mishalim nezek shalim. And tam is going to pay chatzi nezek, and the muad will pay nezek shalim in these cases. Nivritza b'layla, let's say something happens at night, that the fence gets opened in the middle of the night, Osha Partsu a listin, or let's say robbers come along and they open up the fence, V'yotsta v'hizika, and then it goes out and it does damage in that situation. So pater in that situation, we're going to say pater. And the Gemara now analyzes this brisa, but the point over here is that's what Keshizach chav hamazik is coming to include. It's coming to include these cases that involve damages, that involve either a shomer chinam, or a shoel, or a shomer sachar, or a socher. And the Gemara now analyzes the above brisa. Amar Mar, the master said, Keshizach chav hamazik lahavi shomer chinam v'ashoel nosei sachar v'asocher. Again, the phrase Keshizach chav hamazik comes to include a shomer chinam, shoel, a borrower, nosei sachar, a paid watchman, or a socher. That's a person who's renting. And what exactly is the case over here? The Gemara says, Hey Chidami, what exactly is the case? The Gemara says, Ilema da'azke tura demashil latura deshol. If you're going to say the case is that the person who's lending, that ox that belongs to the lender, that goes ahead and does damage to the ox of the borrower, so that doesn't make sense that you're going to have to pay in that case. Leimale, because then the lender can say to the borrower, Ilu azik bialma boys shalume at. Let's say this animal that you're watching my animal now, you're a shoel, you're a borrower, if it did damage to somebody else, you'd actually be responsible, not me, because you're the shoel, you're the borrower, you're taking responsibility on my animal. So hashda da'azke lator didach, now that the animal gored your animal, ba'ina l'shlume, I need to pay, of course not. You're the one taking responsible for my animal as a shoel. So that cannot be the case. So what does it mean rather? Ela da'azke Torah the shoel, Torah the mashil. Rather, you'll say the case is that the ox that belongs to the shoel actually does damage to the ox of the mashil, the ox of the lender. But again, leimole, he should say to him as follows: Ilu itzik me'almo. Let's say it was damaged from somewhere else. In other words, you're taking responsibility for my animal, says the lender to the borrower. And let's say my animal got damaged, you're responsible for all onsin, you're responsible for anything. So bois l'shalume, kule tur, you'd actually have to pay for the entire ox. So hashta da'azke Torah didach, but now that you're sure gored my ox, and let's say it's a tam chatzi nezek, so palga nizkahu d'mishalmasli, you're only going to pay me half. That doesn't make sense either. You're not going to say in that situation that you treat him like a regular damager because he's responsible entirely for this animal. And so therefore the Gemara says, Liolam da'azke Torah d'mashul Torah d'shol. The case actually is where the ox of the lender gored the ox of the borrower, and then the question is again, isn't the borrower responsible for everything? Not necessarily. Because the Gemara says, V'hacha b'mayaskinim, because here what happens to be the case, Shekibel olav shmiras kufu, that the only thing the shoel accepted was to watch over the animal, but he was not going to watch over any damages that the animal does to somewhere else, to something else, and so therefore in this particular case, he is not going to be responsible for the damage that the ox of the lender does, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yudalid Amud Aleph.